be on strike and fighting the university with you all. So thanks so much. I might pass it over to Garima.
Hi, y'all. It's great to be here, and I'm really loving the vibes on the digital picket as well. My name is Garima Raheja. I'm a first-year student and PhD student in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. I got involved pretty quickly when I came here. I'm really passionate about all student workers getting fair healthcare that can help us survive the pandemic and other diseases and illnesses that we all have to deal with. So I'm really excited to be here. I'm really passionate about environmental justice, and since being at Columbia, I've learned a lot about how Columbia has played into the environmental racism that goes around our community. So I'm excited to share some of that today, and hopefully we can mobilize around these issues moving forward. I'll pass it back to Colleen.
Sorry, Garima, do you want to go ahead and get started?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I don't know. Sorry. I thought introductions. Sorry about that. Yeah, we'll start off quickly just by defining environmental justice for everyone that's in the room. So these are some basic introductions, and then we'll go deeper into these topics during our presentation, but we thought it might be good to get everyone on the same page. So from Dr. Robert Bullard, who's known as the father of environmental justice is embracing the idea that all communities are entitled to equal protection of housing, transportation, employment, and transportation energy. So it's, a concept that's rolled out in equal protection, equal access, and also then equal enforcement of the policies that we've set forth. And then Dr. Robert Bullard also talks about how environmental policy and practice, that disadvantages certain communities or disproportionately impacts certain communities is a huge part of what plays into environmental racism. So this often happens on communities based on race or color. And we've seen this, across the United States and also across, global dynamics where the global South is treated differently or is often, used as a wasteland for products and resources, resource extractions by the global North. So from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's an abolitionist scholar, all racism works as group differentiated vulnerabilities to premature death. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about how environmental racism and policies that lead to health outcomes and different levels of death in our communities. So moving on to the next slide. The birthplace of the environmental justice movement is often denoted as the protests in Warren County in North Carolina, where 55 people were arrested in a protest at a toxic dump. This was in 1982. And if we move on to the next slide, in 1987, there was a toxic waste and race report, which really emphasized that race is the most important predictor of proximity to commercial hazards and facilities. And 3 out of 5 Black and Hispanic Americans lived in communities with at least one abandoned or uncontrolled toxic waste site. And, in 2007, there was a renewal of this kind of work and little to no change was shown, and racial disparities are way worse than they were previously found. A lot of people wonder, what came first, the residents of these communities or the toxic waste that pollutes them? And that's a great question. I think it's important to understand that both of them play into each other. And it's not often, just the siting of these projects, but also the long-term impacts, the way that they're phased out, and the way that policies around them are enforced, and the way that communities around them are able to participate in the processes by which we cite and then enforce the policies that create this toxic waste. Moving on to the next slide. There's a lot of discussion about, what is environmentalism and what is environmental justice. So environmentalism, is often starting with things like ecosia or like using a browser where when you search the browser, we plant trees. Environmentalism is really focused on like trees and the planet and animals. This is kind of what you see in a lot of white environmentalist dialogues where people are really just focused on protecting certain natural resources that are really important to, their well-being or their sense of place, or like white capitalist protection of nature. Environmental justice, on the other hand, is, Colleen, if you want to move to the next, is looking at, communities. For example, this is an image of a community in Alaska where environmental protections have not really been afforded to these communities, and they're literally at the forefront of climate change. These communities are, right up by the water and are often collapsing into the water and are being propped up, literally using like metal poles to hold up these communities. And these are often not what you see in white capitalist narratives of environmentalism. These are often like left out of, because these are the communities that are being impacted the hardest and are not being given the resources to recover or migrate or adapt to this kind of work. So it's really important to, think about what our environmentalism and our environmental justice focused on. If we want to move to the next slide. We see, these beautiful images all the time that really pull us into this environmentalism narrative. This is a picture of a beautiful island resort in the Maldives. Environmentalism is often about protecting these, beautiful places that you want your kids to be able to vacation in. But Colleen, if you want to go to the next image, this is a picture of Male, the capital city, which is not that far from the island resort we're looking at in the first picture, but the residents of this community are, living in toxic wastelands while tourists from across the global north are able to come in and vacation on the best parts of the islands. And that's all they're, seeing. And the waste that's produced on these islands is often, what the citizens and the residents of that area have to deal with for a long time. Environmentalism, coming down to it, is focused on just the planet, whereas environmental justice is focused on the people that make up the planet. But really what that comes down to on the next slide is environmentalism, is really always focused on the mentalities of the people who think the planet belongs to them, whereas environmental justice is really about the rest of the people who are, creating the economies of the planet, creating the profit that benefit the people at the top. Environmental justice is really focusing on the people, our communities, and thinking about who is left out of these dialogues.
Great, thanks, Karima. And so I think we're gonna, as far as this presentation, talk a little bit more of like one specific example with respect to climate, which is the relationship between climate and air quality. And so my research is focused on atmospheric chemistry, as is Karima's too. And so this is very near and dear to our heart. And so just in the first place, even just from a scientific perspective, climate and air quality are linked. So many of the same processes that contribute to air quality are also affecting climate change. And so here, just giving the examples of methane and tropospheric ozone. So here we can see a few sectors that are contributing to methane, like natural gas, or you might think of it in terms of fracking, right? Or livestock emissions, also landfills or wastewater treatment plants. So some of these same processes and also methane itself can go on to contribute to tropospheric ozone pollution. And tropospheric ozone is a respiratory irritant. Here, this slide is essentially showing some of the different compounds that get emitted in things like industrial processes or transportation that then go on to react in the atmosphere to form tropospheric ozone. And so, methane is something that gets distributed globally as a climate pollutant, but its impacts in terms of air quality can be felt locally and through tropospheric ozone. And so, just to make a point that essentially many of the same communities affected by poor air quality now are also expected to experience disproportionate impacts of climate change over the coming decades. And so just to talk briefly about, why this is of interest, the mechanisms for health effects of air pollution. I'm going to focus, we're in this presentation, we're going to focus more specifically on just a few things that are listed here. And so in particular, particulate matter and ozone, as well as NOx. And so NOx is something that's emitted from combustion processes that goes on to form either ozone or particulate matter. And the way that we usually think about, these sort of key constituents of air pollution is that, ozone will make you sick and particulate matter will kill you. And so the mechanisms for that are through essentially several different forms of respiratory or cardiovascular illness. And so just to mention that, I think often when we hear about or we think about, trying to approach mitigating pollution, there's sort of this false narrative that that it's rather expensive to go forward and do that. We hear that pushback from industry, but one thing that I hope that you all will take away from this presentation is that we basically have seen really broad growth in a lot of different metrics of human activity and not just GDP in terms of the United States, at least. So this is showing differences in a few different metrics for activity related to air pollution from the 80s onward, with 1990 being a time when there was a really important amendment to the Clean Air Act. And so the purple line on this slide is showing that since then, we've had such a dramatic drop in air pollutants in terms of emissions have fallen by 70% in the year 2019. But at the same time, we see this like dramatic increase, right, in terms of GDP and also even other metrics for activity, including vehicle miles traveled, also population, energy consumption, and essentially less good, but something that we're turning our attention to focus on more, right, is CO2 emissions, right? And so just to make the point that like economic features and our approach to mitigating pollution are essentially decoupled, right? And so just taking that in mind going forward. And so along with that, right, we see that across several different key air pollutants, these different air pollutants have all declined dramatically since the Clean Air Act addendum in 1990. And so this slide is showing essentially the percent of air quality monitors that are above standards that are set based on a few different things, one of which is, the impact of air pollution on public health. And I know there's kind of a lot of different colors here, but essentially what you need to know is that each color is representing a different pollutant. And so we can see this really dramatic drop off in terms of monitors across the United States that are showing really high pollutant levels from 1990 to 2019. And so that's really great, and certainly something that that has improved over time. But that being said, something that maybe has not been as much of the narrative, or something that people are calling more attention to recently, fortunately, is that at the same time we have seen a rise in air pollution in some parts of the world. And as Garima mentioned, right, essentially one feature of this is that a rise in consumption, in particular in the United States, is basically fueling a growth in industrial activity in other parts of the world. And what that does is it degrades air quality in a way that is really deleterious to people's health in those places. And so, I think that's something to think about when we think about, narratives that basically describe, air quality improvements here as basically a resounding success. Is in some ways we've exported, the cost of our consumption to other places. Okay, and even beyond that, even if we look, on a scale closer to home, right? While air pollution in general, in particular on really broad spatial swaths, right, has improved, which basically was what was shown in that line graph from the other slide, just showing those declines over time. At the same time, if we take a closer look, certainly more densely populated areas, and in particular in communities of color, you haven't necessarily seen the same shift, or a shift to the same extent in terms of the benefit of these air quality mitigation strategies. And so what this slide is showing is basically this network of low-cost sensors. This network is called Purple Air. And so broadly, the numbers are indicating an index for particulate matter pollution, which again, is a key contributor to air pollution's role in premature mortality. And so where there's really low numbers, or the green bubbles, are where this index is lower, it's safer for public health, and more yellow or orange are places where the air quality can be dangerous. And so on the left, we're seeing that, if we look at sort of a regional scale, that we see a lot more of like green readings across these monitor values, right? But if we zoom in and look at New York City, by contrast, it's almost totally populated with orange. And so what that means is, where the people are, we're still having a lot of issues with air quality and its impact on public health, and in particular, on the right here, I have included a picture of basically the mapping of M zones, which stem from New York City's history in redlining boundaries. And so, I think we can see even from this really rough comparison, right, that there are some consistencies between where we see the highest air pollutant values and where these M zones occur. And so I'm going to pass it either to Garima or to Casey to talk about that a little more.
Yeah, I can take that from here, Colleen. Let's talk a little bit about redlining, which is a policy that was set forth by the Homeowners Loan Corporation in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I know that seems like a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, but it's interesting to, realize that the effects of the policies that we put in almost 100 years ago are still manifesting in our communities today. So on the left is a screenshot of the Mapping Inequality Project zoomed in over New York City. And on the right side is a image of the same area kind of from this project called the Justice Map. On the left, we're looking at the areas that were denoted as redlined by the Homeowners Loan Corporation or the HOLC in 1930. And the red areas were, kind of delineated as areas where they thought they were unsafe or, usually communities of color, and were not given priorities for loans or other, financial preferences for housing. And the areas that were green were the opposite. Those were the areas that were, wealthy, rich white people who were given preferential loan treatment. And blue and yellow was kind of the stuff in the middle, depending on where the communities of color were filtering in or where they were heading out. On the, oh my God. On the right side, sorry. On the right side, we're looking at the Justice Map, which is an image which shows racial populations across New York City. Wait, I'm so sorry. I'm gonna let Casey take this. My voice is not doing great.
Okay. Sorry for your voice, Grima. Rip to that. So yeah, redlining, as Grima said, is basically the systemic, legal exclusion of people of color from certain neighborhoods, either done via denying mortgages or insurance to people of color trying to buy houses in those areas, or some explicit homeowners association outlawing non-white people. I'm gonna go to the next slide. So if we look more specifically at Morningside Heights and sort of our northern Manhattan area, you can see that Morningside Heights, where Columbia is, was not redlined. It was in the blue region, which is the most prime real estate, basically. Those were classified mostly as high income people, all white, and was deemed a responsible investment opportunity by the Federal Housing Agency. Whereas if you go up slightly to Manhattanville and to Harlem, those were all redlined. So you can see that that's reflected in modern times in our proportion of white versus non-white population. So Morningside Heights is still very white, whereas Harlem is still very non-white. We could go to the next slide. And that really impacts the income now of people living in those respective neighborhoods. So if you look on the figure on the right, people living in northern Manhattan, Harlem, have completely different income levels than people who are living in Morningside Heights, right? So just very, very short spatial difference between those two neighborhoods, but wild differences in the amount of income, healthcare, all of those things, and that's due to the redlining. Go to the next slide. Another impact that has had, as Colleen was saying earlier, is that because redline neighborhoods usually had cheaper real estate, it was easier for industry to kind of weasel their way into these neighborhoods and grab land. Most of the historically redlined districts are now manufacturing zones in the city of New York. So this is wastewater testing and treatment plants. It's toxic dumps, a lot of manufacturing sort of things. And mostly in northern Manhattan, and in particular, the Bronx is where you can see all of that pollution happening. And the figure on the top sort of left is, like Colleen was saying, this is the attributable asthma emergency department visits among children in kind of upper Manhattan area. And it's really concentrated right around sort of the Bronx M zones. So you can see a pretty direct correlation between the redlining, the manufacturing zones that were able to buy all of that land because it was so underpriced. And now health effects and the environmental pollution.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I think we're sticking with.
Could you go to the next slide? So I want to talk a little bit more about the Bronx because it's like one of the most like stunning examples of this. So this was a study done in like the early 2000s. It mostly talks about the 90s, but it's still pretty applicable today. So redlining in general created an environment where minorities were like slightly over half of New York's residents, but most of them lived in a disproportionate amount lived in M zones, so manufacturing zones that are very close to toxics, pollution, all of that stuff. And in the Bronx, that was particularly like skewed towards non-white people because, again, of redlining. And in, from the 90s to the early 2000s, the Bronx had an increase in M zones, whereas Manhattan, like there are no M zones in Manhattan anymore because basically everything just got easier to put in the Bronx. And the Bronx is also home to the major Deegan and the Cross Bronx Expressway, which also create a lot more pollution due to transportation, cars, etc. And then Colleen again.
Great, thanks, Casey. Yeah, so, I am hoping to, follow up on what Casey was saying and kind of zoom into where we're at now and also like offer a more like a specific example of how organizing, in our backyard did a lot to change health outcomes for air quality and also will have an impact in terms of climate mitigation moving forward. And so what this slide is showing, I know there's kind of a lot and it's kind of boring, truthfully. But so this slide is showing essentially NOx emissions. And so again, just recalling that NOx goes on in the atmosphere to form both ozone and particulate matter. So it's a really critical pollutant for us to try and control. This slide is basically showing the emissions from a variety of different transportation sectors. And so I'm focusing on transportation because we've done a really good job at the federal level in terms of mitigating emissions that are coming from point sources. And part of the reason for that is it's kind of thorny to try and approach transportation emissions beyond just like forcing people to do something about their catalytic converters. And so it winds up that there becomes some levels of quibbles between states because there's interstate transport and things like that. But in any case, what this means is that transportation is becoming an increasingly important avenue, both for climate and air pollution mitigation. And so on this slide, I just want to call attention to the point that essentially just a couple of different categories within transportation now have a larger total contribution to US total emissions of NOx than all of the electricity sector. And so I'm going to focus in particular on this one example of on-road diesel vehicles, which include, for example, buses or trucks. Okay, and so in the late 90s, activists in our own backyard in Harlem, called attention to the disproportionate impact of diesel buses in their neighborhoods. And that's something that's within the city's control, right? It's something the city can do to make people have, the city can do to help in terms of mitigating public health effects, right? And so, here's certainly a picture from a We Act rally. And so that's the environmental justice group that led this initiative. I do want to call attention. I noticed when making this presentation that there are some TWU workers at this rally. And so there's some nice labor solidarity with this environmental justice call. And so TWU are the Transport Workers Union. And so that's who, MTA workers are associated with. And I also, found this nice picture of TWU workers who came out to support our fight for our own union recognition. And so in this picture, you can see a GWC shirt in the middle. That's Rosie Ray, who is one of our original bargaining committee members. She never got to bargain because it took Columbia so long to recognize us. but she was really crucial in carrying forward the fight. I'm sorry, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but I also want to mention that, we should do everything that we can to support TWU on our own campus. And so the facilities workers on Columbia's campus are unionized with TWU. And there was a lot that was happening around the time of the pandemic that the university was really trying hard to sweep under the rug. Basically, TWU workers were being, pressured to come back onto campus, without the university providing adequate PPE or protections for, TWU workers, unfortunately. And so GWC, tried to help call attention to their campaign. And in particular, they had a contract campaign for healthcare, which, the university was trying to cut essentially during a pandemic. And also for some of its most critical, essential frontline workers, right? And so anyway, just want to note that, labor solidarity is really important in our environmental justice struggles as well. And to the extent that, we can be active in supporting, other workers on campus in their own fights, I think we should. Okay, and so back to We Act. And so, in terms of their campaign, right, they basically did a lot to raise awareness around how these bus depots were really concentrated in communities of color. And so here they basically, are trying to demonstrate that 5 of 7 Manhattan bus depots were located north of 100th Street. And so really concentrated, near the Bronx and in Harlem. They also, drew the connection, right, between these diesel bus depots and particulate matter concentrations. And so here you can see on this slide, the yellow points are showing where the bus depots are located, and the red points are showing the gradient in particulate matter concentration. And so you can see a close coupling between where these bus depots are located and where there's really high levels of PM concentrations. And so I just want to note, in case it's of interest or interesting, that there's also sort of this feature in Queens near Astoria and Sunnyside. And so beyond just the bus depots, these communities are also affected by essentially where the truck lines are sited. And so in addition to diesel pollution from buses, they're also experiencing, increased truck traffic. And then in Sunnyside in particular, there are some electricity generating units. And so that goes into the M zones that Casey was talking about earlier. Okay, and so from there, they drew the connection, right, between the buses to the air pollution, to the effects that was having on their own communities, right? And so basically showing here that there's much higher asthma risk for people who are living near these depots. And so in particular, I'll just call attention to, what's highlighted close to the number 8 bus depot here, where people were experiencing the highest asthma hospitalization rates in the city, right? And so, making this presentation got me thinking about, the implications of this for health outcomes, as a result of their fight, right? This has had wave effects, and I think a lot more people were better protected against contracting COVID, given the higher health risk for people who have asthma of COVID as a result of the fight from this environmental justice group, right? Okay, and so I think this is a really compelling example of how local organizing can be such an effective tool to try and move the needle and win really meaningful gains. And so, I mentioned that they started this campaign in '97. So it wasn't until 2002 that the MTA agreed to invest in retrofits that have at this point reduced tailpipe emissions from the city's bus fleet by 95%. So I guess part of what I want to say there is that sometimes it takes a long time, as I think a lot of us know here. Me as a 5th year, potentially going to graduate soon, but I am still, I think we should do what it takes, right, in order to win meaningful change. It's exciting. We're almost going to have a contract, right? Okay, and so beyond, so bring it back to We Act. So just last year, the MTA expanded its electric fleet to include all of the M60 buses, right, that are on a route I imagine many of us use. And so, what that means is, the city is so well poised now to reduce its total contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, so long as, we continue to make a shift, right, towards cleaner electricity sources. Okay, and so again, just, this I found to be a really compelling example of local organizing, among, people from communities of color, right, who are disproportionately impacted by air quality. And they were super effective, right, in terms of realizing their goals that, have frankly saved a lot of lives already to this point, and will into the future in terms of their climate, the climate benefits. Okay, so gonna pass it back.
Let's try this again. Maybe my voice will work this time. Let's bring this discussion back home to Columbia University and thinking about what we're fighting for as a union and as a unit versus, what we're up against with Columbia and its history. Want to move to the next slide, Colleen? There is a lot of really great work happening on this already. There's like incredible scholars around the community, community leaders who have been vocal about these issues for a really long time, and it's really up to us not just to listen to these issues, but then actively work towards dismantling some of the systemic racism and some of the institutions at Columbia that have really propped this up. It's vital to realize that Columbia is not just like an educational institution, but also a huge real estate giant. By some measures, Columbia is one of the largest private landowners in New York City. There's so many buildings and apartments and campus resources. And it's also really important to think about, what kind of taxes Columbia pays. There's many other Ivy Leagues that pay way more, but are located in areas where, they're affecting the communities in very different ways. But Columbia, benefits a lot from the real estate that we have. And it's also really important to think about who that real estate benefits. As students, I think we've all dealt with housing crises and trying to find housing and trying to pay for housing, especially thinking about how some of us are going to pay for housing with these pay cuts that the university is trying to inflict on us. I think housing justice is really important to consider. So I think our unit is really, vocal about and thinking about housing issues that affect our community members. But we're also part of a broader community in West Harlem, and our housing and the real estate that Columbia owns has huge impacts on those communities as well. And it's not just about the housing itself, but also all the infrastructure that comes with it. So whether that's the price of housing itself or the price of food that goes with there, and the cost of living that increases, as well as the police presence. So when we gentrify a community like West Harlem, the new residents of it bring in new ideas about how the community should be, and try to change the culture of the community that's existed for a really long time. And often that comes with an increased police presence, and increased criminalization of behaviors that have long been present and are culturally really important to these communities. And are not criminal behaviors, they're just cultural behaviors that new gentrifiers, constitute as criminal behavior or just uncomfortable to their new lifestyle. We've all seen, how local community bodegas are replaced by Whole Foods or other like big giants. So it's really important to think about, how we're changing the way that these communities are living, what they're able to afford, how their practices have to change as a result of our gentrification. And then also about the police presence and who that harms and who that, impacts over the long run as well. Some of you might have heard about Seneca Village, which is a community that existed where Central Park is now. That's a really violent history of how that community was taken over to create green space that benefited rich white community members in New York City. And that was a planned, erasure of a community to create a different kind of community that only benefited certain members. So we can't be affording another Seneca Village in Manhattan. And as Columbia, plans for all this expansion, even if the expansion is to solve climate problems, it's really important to think about how that expansion might in itself be creating the problems that we are trying to pretend to solve. So, we're not the experts on this at all, and there's vocal advocates in the communities that have been talking about this for a really long time. Colleen talked about We Act, that's a really important group. And there's groups across West Harlem, and they have great social media presences and they hold a lot of community meetings. So it's, as we transition into thinking about how to bring justice to our own unit, I think we must work in solidarity with the activists in these communities who are bringing justice on a wider scale, and have been doing this for a really, really, really long time. We want to move to the next slide. looking at some maps of campus. So the Manhattanville campus, the construction is really recent. This is an area we talked about redlining. Casey talked about some of that. We looked at some of the maps. So this was an area that was redlined. This is really part of an ongoing displacement of low-income households, whereas the Morningside Heights campus has existed for way longer, since the 1890s. And this was, never really redlined. It has been stable exclusion of these communities for a really long time. So from the Urban Displacement Project, you can take a look at other delineations of where gentrification is happening, has already started to happen, or is in later stages of happening already. And when you walk around New York City, a lot of the clues for this gentrification are really easy to see. It's easy to see what kind of businesses are being pushed out, which kind of businesses are being brought in. And I think the wildest part is, these folks move into these communities looking to experience the culture that these communities have, but then actively dismantle the same culture that they thought they would benefit from. So, as we do this in the Manhattanville campus, it's really important to think about what kind of cultural systems already exist there, what we're trying to dismantle with our new expansion, and whether we're gonna find out right away that we're doing this, or if we're gonna find out in the long term, the results are gonna be the same. Gentrification has happened in New York, it's happened in cities across the US for a really long time. And it's similar stories over and over again. It's always, the poor communities of color that are pushed out to live farther away from where they work, where they, go to school. Often they are pushed out to communities that are more toxic and more polluted. When they move there, they're not given a lot of power or voice in the government, and then more industrial pollution comes in. Um, but that's not the story that we always have to tell ourselves. There's also really great activism happening in these communities that are actively telling us this is what we don't want to see, this is what needs to stop. So as we work together as a unit to ally together, against our university's ideas of what progress looks like, we can often listen to these local activists and realize the same things are coming from them too. So moving on to the next slide. Just kind of wrapping this up and bringing this back to our discussion of environmentalism versus environmental justice. We talked about how environmentalism is often focused on, the mentalities of the people who think the planet belongs to them, and often the victim mentalities that they take on. We've received countless emails about Columbia's, financial austerity during the pandemic and not being able to have money to support the demands that we're making. But I think when we look at environmental justice, we look at communities that are experiencing a lot of that scarcity, but are making the most of it, and are also just going beyond and providing, mutual aid to each other, providing equitable access, really fighting for equitable transportation, energy, residential policy, asking for police abolition. So when we look at, whose narratives we want to believe and who is truly experiencing austerity and who is still fighting for equal rights and a just transition, we have to start reading between the lines about what Columbia is saying and start, really magnifying and elevating the voices of the community activists that have been, really proving a very different narrative all along. So we got a few questions about the slides. It's really great to hear that people are interested in this work and are, excited to learn more. We're definitely happy to post a link to the slides after we're done talking. Thanks everyone for listening to our presentation. We're also open to questions. So if people want to post comments or questions in the chat, Colleen, Casey, and I are happy to answer questions as much as we know, or direct you to, other experts in these areas who might be able to speak to these issues further. Yeah, thanks.
So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. And we'll give a minute or two for that and see if anyone has any questions. So I see one question. It's, do we know if asthma specialists are particularly concentrated in these areas that are more prone to hospitalizations?
I think that's a good question. I truthfully am not really sure. I can try and follow up on that. I will say that, I think it's worth thinking about, my understanding is that there are just sparse hospitals in general, in particular in Harlem. I think that like that Mount Sinai near us is one of the closest facilities for people to access. And I think that really poses an equity challenge for people who are trying to access care. And also, certainly this intersects, with other issues that, are not unrelated to labor, right? In terms of like, who is it that is provided health insurance, right, as part of their employment in the United States today, right? As we don't have a state offered healthcare, right?
Yeah, I also respond to the question on asthma specialists. I think it's really important to note that there's also like at the same time as the environmental racism is going on, there's Colleen kind of pointed to this, but there's also massive problems with medical racism. And as far as I know, there's not like a surplus of asthma specialists in these areas because there aren't the resources in hospitals to support them. And then at the same time, the hospitals that are in like Washington Heights and Harlem, such as Columbia Presbyterian, also like serve a lot of people outside those immediate areas, and there's like a massive priority on people from Westchester and the areas from that Garima and Casey talked about earlier in regard to redlining in New York City. And I like it's certainly the case with conditions related to environmental racism, but also like you see that a lot with the vaccine distribution right now.
That's a good point. Thanks, Lisa.
Sorry, Colleen, were you going to
Go
answer
ahead.
again?
No, I'm sorry. I think I was going to take your job. Facilitator, my bad.
No, it's okay. I have a question. What are your thoughts on Columbia's plan to build this new climate school? I will say that is a gigantic question with, I'm sure all of you have very like nuanced and complex views on it. So, maybe if you just want to talk about if there's anything like Columbia should keep in mind in this new school, or if putting this new school is incompatible with environmental justice. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
It's a great question, Bernice. Thanks. Yeah, I have definitely some thoughts on this, and I also can provide, Ty and I both probably could provide some context for like how people have responded on our campus, which is Lamont, which is on the other side of the river from Morningside campus. But I kind of want to throw it to, I don't know if the first years do you have any thoughts on it before I say anything?
I can take that really quick. That's a great question. And I actually smiled when I saw that question because some of the students in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences have been organizing the Race, Climate Change, and Environmental Justice Seminar, which is entirely student-led. And we have a speaker every Tuesday and then discussion every Thursday about community-based research. And some of our speakers have included actually Dr. Peggy Shepard from We Act, who we saw pictures of today and learned about some of the activism. And almost without fail, after every single seminar, that question pops up, like someone in the chat brings up the climate school. And we often have our speakers who are, renowned experts in the field and labor activists, or like Dr. Robert Bullard, who we talked about, who's the father of environmental justice, was one of the speakers as well. And so I'm not sure if like we have the most nuanced answers to those questions because, we're actively part of some of the problems and the institutions that perpetuate those problems, but it's been really interesting to hear about those experts, hear that, the answer to that question from those experts. And so I would just love to plug that to the Columbia community. If anyone wants to join that class, it's open to the Columbia community. And also all of our recordings are available, so you can send a message. Yeah. In terms of, I think, what generally the speakers have said is that it's bad. I think while we might be solving climate problems by creating a climate school, there's a weird precedent to set that, the land on which we're going to solve these problems and the institutions that we're going to use to solve them are actually the institutions that have caused the problems, and we're actively gentrifying in the process of doing this. There's also, really unclear messaging about where the money from the climate school is going to go to, what kind of initiatives it's going to fund, and if it's just going to perpetuate more of the same, like academia reinventing community knowledge and marketing as progress, versus if we're actually partnering with community groups and having community-based participatory research and co-production of knowledge as well. So while the idea of a climate school is really great, the precedents that we're setting by doing this maybe will look really great in the press, but in practice will cause a lot of the same problems that we're trying to fix. So I, in the chat, will also send a link to the Race, Climate Change, and Environmental Justice seminar. And all members of the Columbia community are, welcome to participate in it. And we'd actually love to have more students from across departments and in that space as well.
Yeah, I have nothing to add, but just to second everything that Grima said, and to also plug the seminar. It's been really, really amazing.
Yeah, the seminar is amazing. It's also amazing to see what students in our department accomplished in coordinating it. I, have not been involved in that, but I am extremely impressed by how much they have gotten done, and also like what an amazing contribution to our community, and also to the curriculum of our program at Operation. I want to say, like, in terms of the climate school, I think Garima said it extremely well. The only thing I would, just maybe like try to add from like the perspective of how people in like at Columbia responded in terms of people who are doing climate science and climate research is it felt like a very top-down decision, as with many decisions that Columbia makes. And I think that there was a lot of resistance among at least initially among faculty and researchers, because it seemed like, people felt as though it wasn't clear why you wouldn't just put those resources into like existing programs at Columbia. And it also wasn't clear like what our role was going to be in terms of like this new initiative. And so like many things Columbia does, it seems like something that they thought would be flashy and like, maybe contribute to the reputation of the school, but actually like maybe is not the best way of doing that necessarily, right? And so I will say that like in the early stages of the climate school development, like I think like anybody who's interested in that should like attempt to engage with the people who are planning it, because assuredly, now you would have as much or more influence than, in later stages of its development, right? And hopefully like there's a role for like us in terms of pushing them to make it something better than what they would make it, without influence from people who might care about broader equity questions, right?
Yeah, and on that note, they have like open coffee like sessions every Friday where students can just come and like give them feedback on the climate school like planning process. I will say that I was invited to the roundtable, the planning roundtable that Columbia was doing specifically about like broader like community involvement in the climate school, so like Northern Manhattan, community-based research, and they're holding that in late April, which is basically so late in the planning process that it almost seems like an afterthought. So I feel like that just tells you kind of everything you need to know about that part of the climate school.
I think we're like, I don't know if there's any more questions, but I kind of want to say one other thing that I wish I had included in the presentation, if I can just like take this moment at the mic essentially. But, something like that we've been having as a lot of conversations in our own department is that like geosciences as a field is extremely white, and even in comparison to other STEM fields. And so, I think that what the union is fighting for in terms of, in particular, the neutral arbitration process is something that would be really critical for helping students of color, in particular from the retention perspective. And also if people, want to try and seek justice for experiencing discrimination in the workplace. And so just sort of a plug that I think that's just another way that that our union contract and also what we're fighting for is would be, I think, of benefit to future generations of students, and also helping to create a more inclusive atmosphere for students of color.
I don't believe there are any more questions. There's still time if you want to ask any. How can people get in touch with you if they have more questions? I see there is one more question. Are there any other demands we should be making to further the cause of climate justice?
That's a really good question.
I can kick that off with just a few other things. I think there's a lot of calls for not just a clean energy transition, but a just transition to clean energy and to renewable energy. I'm no expert on that, but have been learning a lot about it too. So that's something you could, read more into. Climate justice is also deeply intersectional, and we have to keep it deeply intersectional in order to, really create equity. And that means including prison abolition and defunding the police in our climate justice. It also includes, justice for LGBTQ folks, and especially uplifting trans voices. I think that community has been historically, not just left out of these conversations, but actively harmed from some of the environmentalist activism. So I think it's really important to center those perspectives as well. Of course, like income equity is really important, thinking about members from different socioeconomic classes, different races. I think a lot of times climate justice is just focused on American, ideas of what we want to see, but this is really a global problem. I think one of the graphs Colleen showed earlier really showed how, like products that are manufactured in the global south are then transported to the US and to Europe, and how the pollution and, the air, the water, the land that's polluted, the communities that are harmed in those areas are, we don't even see them. We don't even get to see them. I grew up in New Delhi, India, where my aunt used to work in a factory that manufactured clothes for H&M. I never even got to see those clothes, but I breathed in the smog and the air, that came out of those factories. So I think it's really important to consider that there are folks living in places we don't even get to hear about, and the stories we don't get to see, and we benefit from that exploitation every single day. Just a few other things, yeah. I'll let Colleen and Casey add on to that.
Yeah, on that note, just another way I guess to think about it is that we often describe climate change as a threat multiplier. So, climate change itself is very scary, but the things that create intense vulnerability to climate change are existing social inequalities, and why climate change is so terrifying to minority groups is because the existing equity differences already in our society, like gender discrimination, racial discrimination, food insecurity, natural disasters, already are going to be just further exacerbated by climate change. So you really can't create a climate solution and environmental justice solution independent of societal context. So really the best ways to increase environmental justice are just to work on those social issues, decreasing income inequalities, medical access inequalities, housing insecurity, all of those things.
think this is all really well said. I would have to think more about like what the specifics in terms of our contract would be, but it's a really good question. One thought is like there's definitely a role for us to try and like use like our labor power, like the power we built through our union, to try and like call attention to labor struggles that are happening across the country. And something that I've been thinking about lately is essentially like livestock facilities, right? I think, there in some states, like in North Carolina, for example, the worst air quality is downwind of these big like cattle feedlots. I really have a lot of questions about what air quality actually looks like for people who are undocumented farm workers, right? Like, I don't know how you go about doing those kinds of studies, but I have to imagine that those people have some of the worst air pollution exposure, of just anyone in this country. And similarly, people who work in, for example, like livestock slaughter operations. I've been seeing reports that like people are essentially like using low paid like prison labor, right, for that work. And of course, those have been called into attention in terms of COVID spread, right? And so I think, to the extent that I don't know, like that we can use like, the relative like level of privilege or power that we have, like, through our union to try and push forward or labor struggles right across the country. I think maybe that could be something we're thinking about. I'm really sorry. And those facilities I mentioned are like really big contributors to climate pollutants. Just to set it back to climate. Cool. Also, okay, I think we're pretty much at the end, but I mentioned in the chat, I'm, helping to coordinate distribution of the faculty letter on non-discrimination and harassment. It seems like that's been really effective at the table and putting pressure on Columbia to meet us on neutral arbitration. So if you have any capacity to send some emails today and would be interested in working on that, please get in touch with me. Thanks.
Thank you guys so much. That was an awesome talk. They had put their emails and Garima's Twitter in the chat. So if you have any more questions, feel free to follow up with any one of them. And